Look at a McGuffey Reader from 1879. Hold it in your hands if you ever get the chance. The paper is thick. The print is small. The cover is worn soft from a century of children's fingers. Now open it. You'll find Latin phrases on page 40. Not translated, just printed. Expected to be understood. You'll find references to the Roman Republic, to the Peloponnesian Wars, to passages from Cicero that assume you already know who Cicero was. This book was written for 10-year-olds, and within a generation, almost every copy had been pulled from American classrooms, replaced. The old curriculum didn't evolve. It ended. Let me show you what was in those pages and what happened to them, and I want to do it carefully. I'll tell you what's documented. I'll tell you what's interpretation. I'll tell you what's me guessing. Because those are three different things and they shouldn't be mixed together. Here's what's documented. The McGuffey Readers were the most widely used school books in American history. Between 1836 and 1960, about 122 million copies were printed. That's from the William McGuffey Museum in Oxford, Ohio. They hold the largest archive of these books anywhere. But the readers from the 1830s are not the same books as the readers from the 1900s. The name stayed. The content changed. The 1836 edition, the 1857 revision, the 1879 revision, the 1901 revision. 4 different books, same title. I want to be clear about something. Textbooks get updated. Language modernizes. Standards shift. That happens today too. Nothing strange about it. But the scale of what happened between 1879 and 1920 is different. It's not an update, it's a replacement, and this isn't my observation alone. The historian Diane Ravitch documented this shift in her book, Left Back, A Century of Failed School Reforms, published by Simon & Schuster in the year 2000. She's a mainstream education historian. She served as Assistant Secretary of Education under President George H.W. Bush. Ravitch argues that between roughly 1890 and 1930, American schools moved from a classical academic model to something she calls life adjustment education. Content got simplified. Whole categories of knowledge got set aside. She spends about 400 pages documenting how this happened. She's not alone. Lawrence Cremin, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian at Columbia, covered the same period in American Education, The Metropolitan Experience, published 1988 by Harper and Row. David Tyack at Stanford wrote about it too in The One Best System, published by Harvard University Press in 1974. These are real mainstream historians at real universities, documenting a real measurable shift. This part isn't my theory. This part is settled history. Here's what the 1879 Fifth Reader actually contained. I'm looking at a scanned copy on the Internet Archive right now. You can read it yourself. Anyone can. Selections from Cicero, in Latin, for 5th graders. A passage from Xenophon about the retreat of the 10,000 Greeks. An essay on the ruins of Palmyra. Sections on Roman Republican government. A reading on the Parthenon. Passages from Milton that assumed familiarity with Homer. An excerpt from Plutarch on the death of Caesar. A discussion of the Eleusinian mysteries. The vocabulary level is striking. I ran a sample passage through a modern readability tool. It scored at roughly 12th grade level for a book used with 5th graders. That's not accidental. That's the intended difficulty. The word lists at the back of the book include terms like aqueduct, colonnade, mausoleum, sarcophagus, pediment. For 10-year-olds, expected to learn them, expected to use them. 11-year-old American farm children in 1879 were expected to engage with this material, to write essays on it, to memorize passages, to discuss them in class. The 1920 readers had replaced most of this. Stories about honest shopkeepers, brave firemen, simple farm lessons, moral tales with clear messages. Now, you could say this is progress, making education accessible to more children. That's a fair argument. Ravitch herself acknowledges real benefits. More kids finished school. Literacy climbed. Graduation rates rose. That matters. That's real. But look at what specifically got cut. Geography textbooks from the 1870s routinely referenced places like Great Tartary. That's a documented cartographic term. You'll find it on Sanson maps from 1674. on Covens and Mortier maps from 1757, in Colton's Atlas from 1855, and Cornell's High School Geography from 1866. These maps exist. Anyone can look them up. The Library of Congress has digitized most of them. The David Rumsey Map Collection at Stanford has hundreds of them online, free to browse. By 1900, the name had vanished from American schoolbooks. The standard explanation says this was scientific progress, better cartography. Russia absorbed the region politically. The name became obsolete. That explanation has real merit. It covers most of it. Political borders did change. Mapping did improve. I'm not disputing any of that, but it doesn't fully cover why detailed history of Central Asia also thinned out in the same window, not just the name on the map, the region itself as a subject of study. The 1877 Harper's School Geography, 240 pages, about 40 of them on Central Asia. Fry's Complete Geography from 1903, 300 pages, about 6 pages on the same region, 6 pages. For everything between the Volga and the Pacific. That's not a minor edit. That's a different book, telling a different story. That's the question that won't leave me alone. Why did American textbooks, in a window of about 30 years, narrow their picture of world history so dramatically? What did American children in 1875 learn that children in 1925 didn't? And was there any pattern to what got removed? The question sounds small. It isn't. Let me show you the pattern, and I'll separate what's documented from what's interpretation. Here's what's documented. In 1892, the National Education Association convened the Committee of 10. Charles Eliot, president of Harvard, chaired it. Their report runs 249 pages. It's in Harvard's digital library. It's also reprinted in Ravitch's appendices. The Committee of 10 actually recommended more classical content, more Latin, more Greek, more history, more foreign languages. They argued every American high schooler, college-bound or not, should get the same rigorous academic education. But they were overruled. In 1918, a different NEA body, the Commission on the Reorganization of Secondary Education, published what became known as the Cardinal Principles of Secondary Education. That report replaced the Committee of 10's vision. It was written by a commission of 16 members, chaired by Clarence Kingsley. The Cardinal Principles emphasized 7 goals: health, command of fundamental processes, worthy home membership, vocation, citizenship, worthy use of leisure, ethical character. Notice what's not on that list. No classical education, no deep history, no broad geography, no foreign languages. The word knowledge doesn't appear in the 7 principles at all. This is documented. You can read both reports side by side. You can compare them. Ravitch, Cremin, and Tyack all describe this as the turning point in American education. Historians of education don't really dispute that the shift happened. They only dispute whether it was good for the country. The Cardinal Principles became the template. State boards adopted them. Teacher colleges taught them. Publishers wrote textbooks to match them. And once that template was in place, the curriculum kept narrowing. Ravitch traces this through the 1920s and 30s. Subject matter kept contracting. Life skills kept expanding. By 1945, a movement called life adjustment education pushed even further in that direction. Some schools replaced history entirely with units on dating etiquette and personal grooming. That's not me editorializing. That's Ravitch's documentation, with citations, with named superintendents, with district records. Now here's where I move from documented to interpretive. I want to flag that clearly. The shift wasn't uniform. Some topics got trimmed, others got almost completely removed. And when I look at the specific pattern of what got cut, something interesting shows up. Though I want to stress, this is my reading, not established history. Ancient Persia. 1875 readers had chapters on Cyrus and Darius. 1925 readers had paragraphs. Phoenician trade networks. 1875 readers described Phoenician ships reaching Britain, Spain, and possibly West Africa. 1925 readers barely mentioned Phoenicia. Byzantine history. 1875 readers covered 1,000 years of Constantinople, Justinian, the preservation of classical knowledge through the medieval period. 1925 readers skipped from Rome to the Crusades in a page, sometimes less. A civilization that lasted longer than the Roman Empire itself, compressed to a footnote. Pre-colonial African kingdoms. 1875 readers named Timbuktu, Songhai, Mali. They described the University of Songor. They mentioned trans-Saharan trade routes. 1925 readers treated sub-Saharan Africa as essentially blank until European contact, Islamic Spain. 1875 readers covered Cordoba. The translation schools, the transmission of Greek texts to Europe through Arabic scholarship. 1925 readers often skipped this entirely. Medieval Europe appeared to rediscover the classics through some unexplained process. I want to pause here, because a historian would push back on this, and I want to give their pushback fair weight. They'd say this: the older content wasn't necessarily better. Much of what Victorian textbooks claimed about Persia, Phoenicia, and sub-Saharan Africa was flawed, based on limited archaeology, filtered through colonial biases, sometimes just wrong, and romanticized in ways that don't hold up today. The cuts weren't erasure, they were corrections. The old books treated legend as history. The new books were more disciplined. Less speculation, more verified fact. That's a serious argument. And it has real force. I want to take it seriously and not wave it away. Here's my answer to it. Flawed content should get replaced with better content, not less content. If Victorian scholars overstated Phoenician reach, update the claim. Don't delete the chapter. If Rawlinson got Persian chronology wrong, correct his chronology. Don't remove Persia from the book. A 6-page summary isn't a correction of 40 pages, it's just less information. Corrections add nuance. They don't subtract topics. And the timing is worth noticing. Modern academic archaeology, the rigorous kind that actually corrects Victorian errors, didn't really produce the volume of new findings that would justify these cuts until mid-century. The curriculum changed decades before the scholarship did. The editors who cut the chapters weren't working from new evidence, they were working from new priorities. That distinction matters. One more piece. Reverend George Rawlinson published A Manual of Ancient History in 1869. It was widely used in American seminaries and better academies through the 1880s. The book devotes substantial space to Persian, Parthian, and early Islamic Central Asian history. By the 1920s, American world history textbooks had reduced this entire region to brief summaries. Rawlinson fell out of use entirely. Now, Rawlinson was a Victorian clergyman. His methods weren't modern. Some of his conclusions don't hold up today. A critic would be right to say so. But look at what replaced him. Not better scholarship, less scholarship. The detail didn't get updated. It got removed, and this pattern repeats across multiple textbook lines. Appleton's Geographies, Harper's Readers. Ginn & Company's History Series, Barnes's Historical Series. Not in one place, not in two. Across the American textbook industry, the window is narrow, 1890 to 1925, about one generation. Here's where I have to be careful. I'm not saying anyone hid anything. I'm saying this. The physical books exist. You can compare them. Ravitch, Cremin, and Tyack have documented the broad shift from classical to vocational education. That part is mainstream history. But the specific question, what exactly got cut, topic by topic, from which civilizations, and whether those cuts follow any pattern, that deeper comparative study hasn't been published in a unified form that I can find. I may be wrong about this. A dissertation may exist that I haven't come across. An education journal article may have done this work already. If you know of one, I genuinely want to read it. The Committee of 10 report is at Harvard University Library. The Cardinal Principles report is at the Library of Congress. The personal papers of Charles Eliot are at the Houghton Library. Call number BMS M1405. Anyone can request access. The documents are public. The textbooks themselves fill used bookstores in New England. A serious content analysis is possible. It just hasn't been published in the form I'm describing. There are dissertations on specific textbook lines. There are articles on the Cardinal Principles. There are books on the vocational turn. What's missing is the cross-cutting study, the one that takes 100 world history textbooks and maps what happened to each civilization over time. That comparative work is achievable with modern tools. Nobody seems to have published it. The broader story, classical to life adjustment, has been told well by Ravitch and Cremin. The granular story, which specific civilizations got deprioritized and whether that clustering means anything, still feels unfinished to me. Everything I've said so far is either documented or clearly flagged as interpretive. What comes next is me thinking out loud. I want to be explicit about that. This next part is speculation. Why would the curriculum narrow so fast? Why would world history contract while American history expanded? First possibility, the change was economic. Industrial America needed workers who could read instructions and follow schedules, not workers who could quote Cicero. Publishers, who are businesses, responded to that demand. Evidence for this: American Book Company acquired the McGuffey copyrights in 1890. Their stated goals emphasized cost reduction and mass market reach. That's documented in company records at the Cincinnati Historical Society. Evidence against this: elite private academies kept classical content for decades longer. Phillips Exeter, Choate, Groton. If it was purely economic, you'd expect uniform change. You don't see that. Second possibility: the change reflected a new national self-image. The United States in 1900 was an emerging world power. A curriculum centered on American civic life served that self-image. Old world connections were less useful for building new world identity. Evidence for this: the content that replaced classical material was heavily nationalist. American history expanded enormously in the same decade that world history contracted. Ravitch documents this expansion. Evidence against this: correlation isn't causation. National curricula everywhere became more nationalist in this period. Germany, France, Britain. It may reflect global trends, not American strategy. Third possibility, and this is the one I can't prove: what if something about the older worldview, the one that saw civilization as a web of connections across continents, no longer served the institutions making curriculum decisions? What if a narrower picture of history was, for some reason, more useful? Evidence for this: the cuts did seem to cluster around cross-civilizational content, trade networks, shared traditions, pre-modern globalization, the connections between regions. Evidence against this: my sample is small. I've looked at a handful of textbook lines. A systematic study might show no such pattern at all. I could be seeing faces in clouds. Pattern recognition is the easiest thing in the world to fake yourself into. Here's what would prove me wrong: a comprehensive content analysis of 100 textbooks from 1870 to 1930, coded for topic area by region. If the cuts are evenly distributed across all topics, my thesis fails. If the cuts follow a simple pedagogical logic, my thesis fails. That study hasn't been done. I hope someone does it. These aren't answers. They're questions worth asking. That 1879 McGuffey Reader is still there. You can buy one on eBay for about $40. You can hold it. You can read what a fifth-grade farm child in Ohio was expected to understand. Latin on page 40, Palmyra in the selections. Cicero treated as familiar ground. Xenophon alongside arithmetic. The book is real. The child who read it is long gone. The classical curriculum that trained that child ended within a generation of its peak. You weren't taught what that child was taught. Your parents weren't. Their parents weren't. Something was being handed down. And then it wasn't. The books are still on the shelves, in museums, in university libraries, in old farmhouse attics. The records are public. The comparison is possible. Someone just has to do the work. Thanks for watching the video.